Today I'm talking to an author with a degree in physics and history from Melbourne University, a postgraduate degree in library and information science, and a PhD in medieval literature. He was a professional musician in the 1970s, concentrating on singing and guitar playing. He sold his first stories in the late 1980s. In the late 90s, he established himself in the American market, and his work has been translated into Polish, French, Japanese, and other languages. The settings for Sean's work range from the Roman Empire through medieval Europe to cities of the distant future. His work is a mixture of romance, invention, and adventure, while populated by strange but dynamic characters. His novelette 8 Miles was runner-up in the 2011 Hugo Awards, and his next novelette, 90,000 Horses, won the Analog Readers Award in 2013. As well as he's just been shortlisted for the Sideways Award, and he's previously won several Aurealis Awards, Ditmar Awards, Analog Awards. The list goes on. Welcome, Sean McMullen.
Thank you.
Please explain your diverse career.
My diverse career. Well, I like a good story, and I like my stories to be possibly real. So, I read a lot of history because that's real, of course, and studied a lot of physics and science. That's terribly real. But then when I started writing my own stories, I thought, well, I'll write them as close to the truth as possible. I'll write my historical stories to fit into the little gaps in history where everything's just a little murky. And when I speculate about what might happen in the future or the very near future, I'll use as little hand-waving as possible and maximise the hard science so that people will think, wow, this might actually happen, this could be really cool, or oh my goodness, I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah. So, how has it impacted on your writing?
How has the diversity impacted on my writing? Mm-hmm. Having very diverse interests actually puts you a little bit ahead of the pack, because quite a lot of people get their fantasy and even get their science fiction from reading other people's fantasy and reading other people's science fiction. And once you step out of the field and start looking at the real world, you see most incredible things, and you can then extrapolate them a little further. I once read about a steam bellows that was developed and used in the 12th and 13th century in Europe, and that became the basis of the medieval steam powered boat. It was like a Viking boat that was powered by a particular type of steam engine that I invented. I checked it with a ship's engineer later on, Jetsy de Vries, and he said, no, nobody's ever had an engine like that, this is the first. So in the 21st century, I invented a medieval steam engine. I tried it out in the bathtub, it worked. And so that was the basis of that story. That was published in fantasy and science fiction. And I always remember the next year at the World Science Fiction Convention, Stan Smith of Analog came along and said, look, really enjoyed that, the Spiral Briar, but I'd like to know why you sent it to fantasy and science fiction, didn't send it to us first. I said, well, it's got elves in it, you know, magic, this is Analog, Analog doesn't go in for that sort of thing. He said, but there's, you know, a new type of steam engine, and there's very hard science in there, and for that sort of thing, we at Analog are prepared to put up with a few elves.
So they were a bit miffed.
They were a little miffed, but that was in, where was it, in Montreal in the Worldcon. And I remember leaving the party and feeling really bad that Stan was, why didn't you send it? So I thought I'll write something, and on the way back to my room, I'd had various images for stories in my mind, and I had this one of the balloon looking down from, well, it was originally 9 miles, and these people who didn't have their own oxygen and that sort of thing, and I thought, yes, that's quite a cool idea for a story, and I've had that mapped out for a while. I think I'll write that one and send it off to Stan, and of course that's the one that was runner-up for the Hugo. So once again, I've always got 20 or 30 themes and stories batting around in my mind, and I'll just sort of pull one out of the air every so often. I've got to write write you up as a story, and it's currently what I'm doing. I've got about half a dozen quite big projects going right now, all on different ideas, and it's getting the spare time to work on them is rather difficult.
Yes, you have a day job as well. How do you balance both?
Not easily. I think what really, I'll come at it the other way around. All of my study, I've got 6 sets of letters after my name, and all of them have been done studying part-time. So 7 or 8 years getting my first degree, and then did the information science one, and then I did computer science postgraduate after that. Then I did a master's, mixed discipline master's, and then did management for scientists and engineers. That's right, that was the next certificate I did, and then I did the PhD, of course, and all of those are part-time. And I became so good at allocating my spare time really efficiently that when I decided I started writing in basically 1980, I did my first amateur stories. I was so good at allocating spare time that, no problem at all. Eventually writing whole novels in my spare time is just another form of a master's or a PhD, I suppose you can say.
So you've made study a lifestyle, and that's transferred neatly into writing.
Well, sort of. Sometimes I wonder why I did so much study. I'm not thought about it. Not entirely sure why I did it. Why did I do my PhD? Well, yes, getting DR in front of my name isn't quite a good enough justification. And then I saw that interview with Neil Gaiman about, well, you're saying I never graduated from any, I never even entered the university. I thought, well, yes, that's a good point. Why did I go to all those degrees? Still thinking about that.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yes, I suppose it did.
Yeah. What authors and novels have influenced you?
Authors and novels have sort of come into fashion and then gone out of fashion again for me. Started off, I suppose, with Jules Verne. I think they did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Walt Disney did a version of that in the mid-1950s, and that was sort of in the theatres and on television when I was a very small child. And then I graduated to H.G. Wells from that, and then read practically everything. In fact, there's a H.G. Wells there with my iPod on top of it. And from there I went on to Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, then discovered Theodore Sturgeon and slightly more outre sort of science fiction. Harlan Ellison came out in 1983, I think he first came to Australia, and I was quite influenced by his very economic, fast-moving style of writing. So for a while I sort of bought every Harlan Ellison I could and read the stories, and after you've read the main ones, I think, after a while you start moving on to something else. So quite like the Flashman series, so once again I got hold of all of those and read them all. And then eventually, well, what else is for comedy? And Terry Pratchett came along in the late 80s, and I started reading I was a fairly late comer actually to Terry Pratchett. George Turner gave me one of his books, I think it was Equal Rights, when did he give it to me? About 1990, I think. I didn't get round to reading it for a couple of years, I'll confess now, but in a way that's good, because I can't say he influenced me, because people looked at my work and, it's just like Terry Pratchett. Well, no, I haven't read the man yet. And then I thought I'd better catch up with this Pratchett that I'm supposed to be like, and then so I read his works, and then I met him in 1993, and we're actually the same age, but he's sort of, it's not entirely the same looking as me, but our styles and tastes are rather similar. And so for one reason or another, I get hold of an author, I'll read everything they've, or all their principal works anyway, and then I'll go on to something else, and it's usually for some strange reason, like we're going to be at the same con, so I'll read it all. In 1992, I think my first book came out, And the publisher said, well, come across to Adelaide. There's a national convention on, and we can launch your book and you can sit on panels and talk about things. And we've got Lumsden, DeVry, the comic duo, and there's this English guy who lives in America who's written some fairly cool comics. You may have heard of him, Neil Gaiman. And yes, I've heard of Neil Gaiman. I better start reading his work. So I started reading his work, and I've read quite a lot of his work by the time I met up with him in Adelaide. And then, of course, my daughter grew up a bit more, and she discovered Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman and appropriated them all from my library.
So did you ever see them again?
I see them from time to time, and I borrow them back from time to time too.
You've written across genres and time periods. How and why?
Time periods, I suppose. Like, I'm very fond of history, so I like the idea of being able to scan very large periods of time and see how things develop. So people going into the future and looking at things and then think, well, how could I make it really, really real? And, well, freeze people, that's a form of time travel, so a very strange idea for that. I thought of a Roman time traveller. What would Romans need to time travel? And the idea for that came out, as things tend to, from a dream. I had a quite weird dream that I was a work for the Weather Bureau. I was in an expedition trying to set up an automatic weather station, an AWS as we call them, and we discovered an ice cave when we were in there, and this Roman warrior came out and he killed everybody else in the expedition, and I got a little bit of Latin, so I tried to explain that, please don't kill me, I'm really, quite innocent. And then he started to explain in Latin that, or in some incomprehensible language in the dream that I assumed was Latin, that he was part of a Roman time machine. I woke up and thought, oh God, this is cool, I've got to write this down, which I did. And so that became the basis of the Deciad, which I started writing. I suppose it shows my wisdom, being able to criticise myself. I started writing that very late in 1983, and I wrote the first version of it, and I thought, I need to become better as a writer before I write this up. This is such a good story, I can't let it go as it is. So I did wait about 2 years till 1985. Then I went back to it, and that particular story won the World Science Fiction Convention's writing competition that year, and that really launched my career. And then 2 years later, I was at south of England, Canterbury, looking at the various ruins and little holes in the ground that people had, used to keep their meat in, or whatever they did with holes in the ground at Canterbury. And I thought, suppose if you harvested the snow during the winter and put it down one of those holes, you could have a sort of little frozen area where you could keep a frozen Roman. So that tied in with the story I'd already written about the Roman time traveller in Antarctica. Because my idea was they got a Roman fleet down to Antarctica where they built this time machine. But I thought, if you could do it in Britain, wouldn't that be a really cool idea? So I had this whole village devoted to keeping this guy frozen, and they'd harvest and compact snow into ice during the winter and take it down and keep him frozen all through the year, and they did this for a couple of thousand years. And that was the basis of my novel The Deciad, which is somewhere up on the roof packed away in boxes which I haven't yet unpacked. So that's basically like the origins of my career. Dreams feature fairly heavily. I'm a bit like James Cameron, a really good nightmare is really first class as a story. The very first story I wrote that was published, like I wrote a couple of stories when I was a schoolboy. I was 14, I think, and they got quite good marks, but they never got published. But I wrote a thing called Killer. I was doing a postgraduate in computer science at that stage, and there was program that ran around the computer after dark, killing off overquota files belonging to the students. So I was asleep and I dreamed that, like I used to go to the folk club where I'd sing at that stage in 1979, this all happened. And then about 11 o'clock I'd leave the folk club, and instead of drinking on and trying to chat up girls and that sort of thing, I'd go onto the computer centre at La Trobe University, and I'd work there until morning. There's very little in the way of crowds, and I dreamed that I dreamed riding up on my motorbike and going into the computer centre, letting myself in. It was all hyper real, and there was a Chinese student there, as a friend of mine, who wasn't in my work group, and we started chatting, and then I suddenly saw this really strange figure scrolling down the screen. I said, look at that, and suddenly this huge genie came out of the screen and said, I'm killer. And I've decided that instead of killing off overquota files, I'm going to kill off the students instead. And it grabbed me and the student and dragged us into the thing. And I remember this incredible lattice. It was like something out of the Matrix or something like that. This lattice of computer internals, and it didn't look like boards. It just looked like sort of, it's hard to describe, sort of like a very strange modernistic landscape. And anyway, at 8, the student in front of me and said, I'm going to save you and fatten you up. And then suddenly I was back in the lab, and the rest of my study group had come in. They hit the Control Y key, and they tied up this genie because they cut him off from the program, and they tied him up with cords from the computing equipment, and they were stabbing him with a little fruit knife that one of the guys used to carry. And at that stage, somebody rang the front doorbell to deliver a washing machine, and the whole dream went. It was like, Coleridge Taylor and writing Kublai Khan. But I wrote up the story as it was, and it got published in a university science fiction society's magazine called Yggdrasil, which was an amateur fiction magazine. And it actually got about halfway through the readers' poll. It was 10th out of about 20 or something like that. And I was quite impressed that anybody would vote for me at all. And then, so I kept on writing for it, and eventually I won the readers' poll a couple of years later. And but it was very encouraging. It sort of was like feedback on the net these days. The amateur magazine filled that same sort of role back then. And I said I suppose in the first 5 years, from 1980 to 1985, I learned the craft of writing. I always had the ideas, and I always had the interest. And I'd even done honours at English, 1 unit of it at least, at university, just for fun. But, just until you start writing, you don't have the writing skill. You've just got to write. It doesn't matter what the prospects are for being published, just write, full stop. Show it to people by all means, but don't say one day I'm going to write the great novel. Start writing it now. That was my experience. It wasn't until I started writing that it really all pulled together.
You've written a lot of short stories and you've written novels. Do you have a preferred size? Like you're talking about writing a great novel. Do you prefer to write novels or short stories? Or?
I'm extremely sort of unfaithful to any of those forms. Let's have a look. What have I got here? I've got this one, which is based on some of my folk music thing, called Summoning the King, which I hope to put up on my website, which is just under 1,800 words. If you play King of the Fairies 3 times, the king is meant to appear, and if he doesn't like the party or at, will cause mischief. So I've written a just over 1,700 word story around that, for basically for reading. I'll put it up on my website when I've got the music sorted out. Usually when I write a decent short piece, it pounds out between 9,000 and 11,000 words. So that seems to me my preferred length. But sometimes I'll get a really great idea that will just crystallise beautifully in 2,000 words. And I wish I could do more of it. I like that very short form, but I know I tell my best stories at between 9,000 and 11,000 words. beyond that, I really like novels because you can actually develop the character at your ease. You don't have to cut corners. You can let the characters speak more for themselves. And then there's two classes of novels, of course, and the young adult novels. Before the Storm, I suppose, was my first reasonably seriously written young adult novel, and I quite enjoyed doing that because I could develop each of the characters separately, and they all had quite separate personalities, and they all were dealing with that rather nasty period of life between about 13 and about 16, where you're not quite a child and you're not quite an adult, and you're learning the rules, but there's nobody there to teach you the rules of how to be an adult. So it's absolutely hilarious time of life to write about if you're an author, but it's bloody infuriating if you're a kid. So yeah, I really quite enjoyed that. And then of course in the sequel, Changing Yesterday, Daniel grows up a bit more, and he's trying to cope with the fact that he's actually a very attractive, very handsome young man, but he still thinks a bit like a child. And on his voyage out to England, he actually becomes a man, I suppose you can say. So.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the 200,000 word Sold in the Great Machine and things like that. And that you're really telling an epic when you're doing that sort of length there.
So you've written a few thumpers.
Souls in the Great Machine is about 200,000 words, and the two other books in the trilogy were both about 180,000 words. In fact, 180. The Moon Worlds, the fantasy ones, Voyage of the Shadow Moon was about 190,000. Glass Dragons was about the same length. And there was meant to be a third one, which was almost like a combination of War of the Worlds and the Time Machine in a fantasy setting. And I ended up having to, for some reason, the publisher wanted to split up into two books. And I can't work out why, so I had to pull the two stories apart. And it ended up extremely messy, but they got their two books, but that should have been about 180,000 words as well. But as I said, got pulled apart. Maybe one day I'll put it back together and put it out as a separate book.
Put it out the way you wanted it. Yeah.
Probably not, actually. I've got too many other things I want to write.
Do you have a favourite genre or a favourite time period?
Very difficult to say. They've all got something to do with it, and as I said, things come into fashion and go out of fashion with me. I've always liked the Victorian period. I said my earliest reading as that tall, sort of upwards, was like Verne and Wells and all that sort of thing. And I suppose when I started writing, which is when I started writing what's now called steampunk or gaslight romance, yes, it fitted in perfectly because I know the technology extremely well. I've done a lot of work on Victorian fiction, like that one unit of honours English I did was on the romance novel in Victorian society, English Victorian society, and so I've got a very soft spot for the Victorian period. It's intensely romantic, but on the other hand it's quite close and it's relatively comfortable, and you don't have the same horrors that you do in the medieval period, which is also terribly romantic, but yes, there's just some combination of the clothes and the technology and the fashion and even the manners. They were quite well mannered then. And, in a way where anything goes in our current world, I think people have got a secret hankering for a bit of structure in their social lives, and then that's actually filled by the sort of the steampunk and the gaslight thing. So I'd probably confess, yes, I like the Victorian period a great deal, but I'll write in any period.
Yes. Do you have any favourite characters you've written?
Character I particularly liked was Danilarian, oddly, and in the Moonworld series, he featured as he was the son of an evil emperor who was actually quite a decent young man, and he just wanted to get on with a decent life without without all the background of his father. So he was a prince, but he didn't want to be a prince, and he ended up being a sort of an itinerant policeman, you know, sort of like the Rangers and Lord of the Rings, a bit like that. And in charge of some very peculiar sidekicks. And he spent most of his time sort of trying to make a bit of order out of, you know, chaos and really quite bad situations, in spite of having a lot of very incompetent people around him. So he was a symbol of law and order and civilization in general, but he was sort of also a bit long-suffering, and there's something about that appeals to me. I quite like civilization and order, but on the other hand, if you don't have peculiar people on the scene, it stays like it is forever and becomes quite boring. Like Glaskin, the character John Glaskin from the Great Winter series is quite the opposite. He's a real ne'er-do-well, and he's a womanizer and gambler and drinker, and a lot of people really loved him, and some people thought he was my alter ego, but I'm basically really not a John Glaskin. I'm more of the Danilarian, I suppose you can say. And different characters. I mean, there's a lot of very strong female characters that have in my novels as well, but I suppose if you say there's a favourite character, well, it's because you identify with them. I don't know if other people would agree with that, but...
Oh, I think it's very much a personal thing. I think sometimes some authors really love their villains.
Goodness, the alter ego coming out.
Maybe it's a bit of the anti-hero kind of thing.
Glaskin certainly was an anti-hero, but like Lemuel was, she was one of his victims, I suppose you can say. She was highly intelligent and very driven, and she turned into a very nasty piece of work because he'd basically corrupted her. So, yes, I mean, I rather liked her, but eventually, you know, for various reasons I won't go into now, she was killed late in Souls in the Great Machine, and I got a reaction from the fans rather akin to George R.R. Martin got after the Red Wedding.
How dare you!
They liked Lemuel, and they did not like the fact that I killed her, and so yes.
So you were the dastardly author.
I was a dastardly author, but I had reasons for doing it. And one of the reasons is, well, if you live in a dangerous environment, you're likely to be killed, and sometimes things happen almost at random, and you've got you need a bit of structure in there, but you need some randomness as well. I remember coming back, I'd been in a convention with my daughter, where Terry Pratchett was, he'd come across from England in 2011. And we met across to see. Yeah, I mean to meet up with him. I've known Terry for years, and I wanted to catch up with him. I thought, unless I go to England, it might be the last time I see him. So I went across there on the way back. I was having a conversation and said, if I had some of the advantages now, you know, in terms of background and making use of opportunities, I'd use them quite differently to the way I did in, say, late 80s, early 90s, when I didn't really have a mentor. I never really had a mentor of any sort. You tend not to have them in Australia. And I thought, but now I know all this stuff, I'd use my opportunities quite differently. And of course, when I looked in the inbox of the internet, you have been nominated for a Hugo Award. Wowee! And yeah, so I decided, yes, I'd use it as an opportunity, and I'd enjoy it. And it was quite interesting to hear, once again, Neil Gaiman saying that Stephen King once told him, you're having a really great time with The Sandman, you should enjoy it. And I actually came up with that by myself. I've got a Hugo nomination. I've been going to Hugo Award ceremonies to pick up for people in Interzone or Greg Egan or whoever else for years. This time I'm up for a Hugo Award. I'm going to go across and I'm going to enjoy it. And I did. I didn't win. I came runner-up, but I thoroughly enjoyed the whole experience of it. And
but don't you think that being shortlisted, being a runner-up, isn't that a bit like going to the Olympics? I mean, even if you come last in the race, you got to the Olympics. And if you got shortlisted, it's even better. It's more like you got a bronze or a silver.
Just going to say, in terms of science fiction, to carry the analogy of the Olympics a bit further, it's like getting Olympic silver. There's any number of people who wouldn't cheerfully kill to get Olympic silver, so here you go, runner-up. I mean, yes, I'll have one of those, thank you.
Absolutely.
So that was quite superb. And I mean, I've actually won a lot of other awards. I won 15 awards.
I got to the point where it's like, no, I'm not going to count these. I'm not going to amalgamate these because I'm going to make a mistake.
I think I actually got more. I've got some amateur awards as well, but anyway.
Yeah. You're not afraid to write strong female characters and even having the guys tag along. So what's that like?
This was a very interesting product of the 1960s. I watched The Avengers, and of course Emma Peel came on. I thought, wow, isn't she great? And the interesting thing is, I didn't see her as a sex object. A lot of little boys probably had some very lurid dreams, which we'd probably rather not talk about. With the character, but I thought, wow, she's just great. I've got I'd love to create a character like that. And of course, that was the mid-1960s when I was starting to write my own fiction for school projects and such, and I just thought, oh, this is so good, having a strong female character. And then there was an Australian science fiction series called Wajinja, based on the Aboriginal rock art, where they one of the Saunders, I think G.K. Saunders, who created it, said he'd seen some of the Aboriginal rock art and he thought it looked like space helmets, and he'd written this thing about some aliens trying to repair their spaceship in the outback. And eventually the army comes along to check up on them, and it's led by a lady called Dr. Smith, who was another version of Emma Peel. And she took no nonsense from anybody, and she was a really strong character. I thought, wow, yes, so that's another Emma Peel there. This is really great. And so I suppose it's even pre the International Women's Year and all that sort of thing. There was some really great work being done on with quite strong women in the 1960s, just at the time when my attitudes to life in general and fiction in particular were being formed, and it really stuck. Taken a bit further, I stopped writing in the mid-60s or mid to late 60s because basically I discovered it was much more fun being on a stage with a guitar than you get girls looking up at you, and that was a lot of fun. So, I was in a couple of amateur bands, schoolboy sort of things, and from then learned to sing. And I wound up in the State Opera. I got into folk music, and from there I went to the University Choir and was recruited by Richard DeVal, went to the State Opera. And one of the operas I was in, it started off in a medieval opera called The Son of Getron, which was a miracle play. I played a rather nasty soldier, and but then we had a thing called The Breast of Therese, written by French composer called Poulenc in 1945, about a very strange little town called Zanzibar, where a woman called Therese changes into a man because she doesn't like being a woman. And there's one scene played by Suzanne Steele when I was in it. She reaches into her breasts and pulls out a couple of balloons, and then myself and somebody else who had little pins at the end of our cigars popped them. And that was her symbolically turning into a man, and of course all the men then had to change into women, and the population crashes, so one of the men, Theresa's husband, invents a baby making machine. It gets out of control, and it makes, I even remember the number of babies, 43,009 babies made in a day.
Oh, wow.
And I was one of the technicians running the baby making machine. But you see the undercurrent over there. There was Therese, who was the very strong woman. The whole business of male and female roles. And oddly enough, the opera had Therese going back to being a rather flat-chested woman. She went back to being a woman. They went back to their traditional roles, but in a more egalitarian sort of hierarchy. They were no longer men doing this and women doing other things. The roles were more interchanged. So it was almost symbolic of what was going on in society. And in a strange sense, it was a fairly good, like in 1945, it was about 30 years before all this really happened in real society, but it largely predicted what happened. There was some very violent female outbursts, all the bra burning business that went on, and all the rather extreme excesses, and then it really settled down into a better balanced society after that. So it was quite a good opera. But I earned $60 for performing in that opera, and that was my first money in science fiction. It was basically a science fiction opera, and so I started off, but once again, very strong female characters continued to influence me, and then towards the end of the 1970s, of course 1979, I had that dream, and Jappo was sharing a house with Peter Lamb. One day when I was complaining about, I had a cold and I had to sing in a band or something, and so you're always complaining about singing is difficult, and you're working and then you're studying and then you're trying to fit in rehearsals and performances. Why don't you're always complaining about Australian science fiction being, not very good. Why don't you write your own? And you'll never have to
complain again,
stand up in front of an audience, stand up in front of a camera, do all of this sort of stuff. I thought, yeah, that's a good idea, and I'd had my nightmare by then about Killer, so I went out and bought a cheap electric typewriter, and basically that's when I started writing. So, then once again the strong female characters were quite well ingrained by then.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if you consciously use archetypes in your writing.
Probably not, I'd say. I like things to be a little different. I like things to be a little bit weird. I like things to be a bit off-centre. When I see some of the characters that other people put together, I think, wow, yes, that'd be really great. Isn't it superb that somebody has done X, Y, or Z, or whatever it is, like when Terry Pratchett wrote Guards, I thought, isn't this really great? Dedicated to those brave men who come in and get slaughtered by the hero in chapter 3 and that sort of things. I thought, this is really great. Somebody's told their story and has told it in a really great fashion. And in a sense, that sort of thing has become an archetype itself now. So I really love it, but I wouldn't actually write it myself. You've got like death in all the various forms. That's become an archetype. The character who comes and claims your soul, whether it's Neil Gaiman's death or Terry Pratchett's death, or death in The Seventh Seal, death in a really great silent film called Destiny, actually. They're all great manifestations, but it's an archetypical character now. And there's a big market for it. Probably haven't seen the end of it, but I'd rather do something more interesting than death. I'd rather do out and do Leading Edge, even though it used to infuriate my agent. But how can I explain it? I was once doing a signing, and I was next to Terry Pratchett, which is not a good idea, but
Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman, Robin Hobb. There are a number of authors that you really don't want to be signing next to.
Anyway, Terry must have had about 2,000 people, around about 200, but I managed to eke them out, so we finished it about the same time. And he wanted to discuss something with me, and he said, "Look, I'm going to a talk on death now. Why don't you come along, and then we'll catch up at the end." And we got into the auditorium. And it wasn't standing room only, it was no standing room only left. And of course, because it was Pratchett, the bouncers sort of cleared a path and took me through with him, and it was I forget all of them, but there were Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett both talking about death on the same stage, and you can just imagine the interest. It was absolutely riveted audience. And I remember thinking it'd be great if I actually had a character called Death, and I did in the Moonwell series. Did have a lady who used to ferry people across the underground river, but she wasn't a major character. She was just, I thought, well, this is a popular and archetypical character, but she wasn't a real. She wasn't that sort of death. She'd sort of, if she didn't like you, she'd hit you with her barge pole, and if she did like you, she'd give you one of her cakes. So, and she took you on to the other side. So yes, I'd use the character. I'd use them as minor characters, but not as major characters. Death wasn't sufficiently interesting. I'd like a different sort of character.
Cool. You're really into martial arts. Do you feel that this impacts on your writing?
No, I would be lying if I said it didn't. Martial arts is something rather strange. I just do it. When I was doing my masters in 1981 actually, it was quite a strange year. I changed jobs and started working with the Weather Bureau. I bought a house and I started doing karate, and actually got serious about writing too, all in the same year. It's very pivotal for some reason, but karate is something I just did because it had fit a lot of exercise into a very short period. And having a crowded life, I thought, oh, this is pretty good. And like it fixed up my posture. I actually grew a tiny amount. I suppose it sounds a bit strange for somebody who does karate, but the thing I really don't like about karate is the fighting. The sort of a lot of the other aspects of training and some style and even like teaching, more subtle things like that. But karate is just something I do rather than a martial art. And of course, I do use the students on occasion to choreograph some moves in the novels and the various things that I do, just to make sure that they're realistic. The girls I've got using pressure points and the sort of ways of handling an opponent a girl has, which are very different to the way guys do the martial arts. And then of course I did medieval armoured fencing, which taught me a lot about medieval style fighting, and I've done 3 years of sabre and foil as well, which taught me about the more traditional style fencing. They're all fun. I've done some French foot and fist boxing as well, just to see what it was like. I did it for about 6 months. But yeah, I'm not a martial arts fanatic. I don't sort of sit stark naked under a waterfall thinking about chi and the Dandenongs in the middle of winter or anything like that. I just, I just go and do karate at the university, and I come home and have a shower and cook dinner. And write.
And make model aircraft? Occasionally.
Yes, and once again, that's not even a passion. As you can see from those photos I showed you before, they're not brilliantly made. I just like to check that the thing can actually work. I'll get hold of a Viking ship and butcher it up a bit and make it into something else just to see what the layout is like. I got hold of a model of Krista Columbus's ship and sort of changed that around into the Shadow Moon, and to see what the layout was like, and it was a lot smaller than I had in my mind, so I had to compress most of what people were doing on this tiny little ship, because I kept on thinking of it as a very big ship. And so I find the models help when you're thinking in terms of, well, what could they do on a ship, or what could they do on an aircraft, and how would the thing fly. The model showed me that the aeronaut, which is the model in the Steam Gothic, was highly unstable. So I wrote that instability into the story. It flew, but it would have been a pretty hair-raising experience to fly it. So yes, I'm not really great with my hands. It's just that if I need to do something, like whether it's building a bookcase or building a model, I can do it. I just can't do it very well, but I do it well enough to get the job done.
But you also understand the theory of doing it.
Oh yeah, but anybody can understand the theory. It's just mathematics and a bit of physics.
You developed a medieval
steam engine.
Yes. The one that you trialled in the bar?
Yes.
Yes, so that's something else that you built?
Oh yes, that was the actual engine. Then I made a plastic model of it to see what the layout of the ship was like, and it was a bit different. I don't have the steam engine anymore. It was cobbled together by odd bits and pieces. I tried to take a picture of it, but it kept on fogging up the lens.
You said that no one had actually developed that particular steam engine before.
No. What I wanted to do, it was fairly inefficient, but it would have worked. And what I wanted to do was to make a steam engine that wasn't dependent on pistons and high precision parts. It was something that a medieval blacksmith could have made.
So you were taking into account that the Babbage engine couldn't be built in the 19th century because of the limitations with the engineering, and you were doing the same thing with the steam engine and trying to build a steam engine within the constraints of that period.
Yes, it was built within the constraints of that period. The Babbage engine actually was built, and they've recently, that was his difference engine, and
I thought it wasn't built until the 20th century.
No, it worked. That was the analytical engine, with 2 engines.
Oh, okay.
They both worked, and I gather Ada Lovelace actually did some programming for the analytical engine, which was a vastly superior machine to the difference engine, which was very specialised. It was like the difference between a handheld calculator and a PC. But it was more finances and politics and a lot of strange stuff like that was going on, and Babbage was a nice guy, but he was a bit of a weirdo as well. He had petitions to stop organ grinders playing outside his window and all this sort of thing. It was, it would have worked. It was more, as I said, limitations of time and vision. A lot of the people who could have supported him just didn't quite have the vision of this sort of thing, and that's where he came unstuck. The technology was certainly there if people had thought about it. You can make computers with electric relays. In fact, quite a lot of the early ones were made. I was in Japan some years ago, the Fujitsu head office, and they had reconstructed an early Japanese electric relay thing, and it sounded like a room full of typewriters, but it actually worked, and it calculated slowly. And it had some problem, and they turned it on for a visitor every so often, and it'd do a few more calculations, and then they'd turn it off again and wait for the next visitor. It was so yes, they could have built that in the 19th century as well, but it was really wasn't more a matter of vision. Vision to think of what to build, and vision to say, well, I'm going to put, I don't know, whatever it was, £10,000 or £100,000 or something on the table for you to build it. And they'd say, well, no, why should I build something that could replace a room full of clerks when I've got a room full of clerks?
For a fraction of the price.
Yeah, the same way as presume the Greeks said, well, why should I build a steam engine because I've got a yard full of slaves who can do the same stuff. So.
Hard Cases is a short film, and it's futuristic sci-fi. That's very different to actually writing a book. So how did this come about?
Well, I've been interested in scripts for a very long time. I was looking through, in fact they're just behind you now, I was cleaning up some old manuscripts, and I discovered a couple of film scripts that I'd written in, I think, 1982. I quite liked the form, and I've written scripts on and off ever since. Started taking it reasonably seriously when I met Dean Tuvey in 2004. There was a NatCon, I was the guest of honour there, and he was there with his fledgling company, and he really got me into writing scripts. And I was round at a friend's place, and Terry Shepherd, who's on the crew for Neighbours, who's directed some of the episodes, was there. I'd actually been introduced to him by Morgan Buchanan, who did a script for a trailer for a longer film, which never got made. But he invited me onto the set, and on the set I met Terry Shepherd, and I met him again following year when the trailer was launched. And then Terry said he's got his own idea for a series, And we got together and tried to get a treatment for a series, but that didn't sell. But after one of these meetings one night, as we were going to our respective cars, Terry said, "I'd like to see a sample of your work." And I said, "Okay, well, I've got a short film which I wrote experimentally as an introduction to a full-length feature film called The Precedent, based on one of my stories. So I'll send that to you tonight when I get home," and sent it off to him. And the next day he said, "Got this thing saying I'd like to make a short film of your script." You know, he said it's a really strong script, and I thought, wow, this is super. So that was, I think, in December, and it took until early September to get the film actually shot, courtesy of Fremantle Media. They just turned their studios over to us on a Sunday, and 3 of the cast of Neighbours came along and did the main parts, and I did a cameo as Mr. Guard. And
yes, I noticed you grinning evilly in the background.
Yes, the director told me to grin evilly, so I grinned evilly. And if it's good enough for Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman to do cameos, why can't I? Anyway, and the post-production was finished by the end of December, and we're now just sending it out to film festivals and such. And it's a fairly hard circuit, but it was mainly put together as a calling card for the longer feature, which is called The Precedent, and it's set in about 2035, I think it is, where there's climatic catastrophe, and everybody who has been born before 2000 is put on trial as a climate criminal and are executed in quite horrible ways. Like the rising sea level, where you're tied to the bottom of a fish tank and the sea level rises, and you can, as long as you can squirt water out, you can breathe, but it continues to rise. And there's the CO2 bag, of course, where you just put over your head and you breathe until you don't have any more oxygen left. The tipping point gallows, where you have a noose around your neck, and the only thing that's keeping the plank from tipping is a large bucket of coal where people come past and take out the coal. And they're called the victim generation, the people who are killing people. And they're basically old people who are being tried, convicted and executed for a prolific lifestyle, which has depleted resources and basically trashed the climate. So it's very bleak and very confronting, but it's also hilariously funny at a long, sort of like a step back and take a long look at it. It's like I've got the old people defying the young people, and they're sort of acting out their favourite TV soaps and having Grand Prix races with wheelchairs in order to try and have heart attacks and cheat the executioners of executing them. And I've got one scene that'll probably never be put on for copyright reasons, where they enact the Rocky Horror Show. And at the end, the audience participants charge the guards, waving walking sticks and throwing rocks, and of course get mown down, but that's their way of cheating their judicial system. So it's and it's set in a desert, and I thought at the time it would be really great in terms of getting appeal, because you've got a lot of retired actors who really like to get back on the screen. And this is one show in which we need a seriously large number of very old people who can actually act. So, but Hard Cases was meant as an introduction, maybe 3 or 4 years in the future. And then that ties in with The Precedent, which is another 20 years further on.
Yeah, after the credits there was that shot of the street sign pointing to
in the middle of the desert. That was in the Streslecki Desert. The sign was originally my daughter, who got pixelated out, and the sign was put in. That's her shadow across the road, in case you...
I hadn't looked that carefully.
Yeah, we needed a desert scene, preferably without copyright on the photos, and I'd taken the photos, so thought we'd use that one. So
Okay. Well, you've done short stories, you've done short novels, you've done doorstoppers, you've done scripts. Is there anything on your bucket list? And it can be bigger than writing, like doesn't have to be limited to writing, but what's on your bucket list?
It's a really strange one. I want to get better stylistically, so I'm always looking at other people's styles, I'm always looking at better ways to write, I'm always looking at more interesting ways to do plots and characters. And I also want to, I suppose, go a bit further in terms of like, well, with films. Yes, I've done a short film, but I'd actually like to get into something a bit more feature length and get a bit more audience reaction. And if you get a favourable reaction, you can get funding and you can do things that are more ambitious. So, and I know people in the industry and they quite like my scripts and that sort of thing, and I've been taken quite seriously. I've come fairly close to landing a couple of shows, and I had an option going for the Centurion's Empire in Hollywood for a while, for a couple of years.
But development hell struck, I gather.
Well, it always happens. My daughter worked as an intern in Hollywood when she was doing her final year arts degree, and she said it was a Berman Brown, a place that does reality television shows. Kitchen Nightmares, I think, was one of their shows. And she said out of every 90 to 100 proposals, one of them would actually get to the screen, and it'd be everywhere from just a treatment, a one-page of treatment, all the way up to, part of a season shot or a pilot shot before, or even they'd shoot most of the season or all of the season, and then they just wouldn't show it, or it goes straight to DVD or whatever else. So there's, it is pretty hard to get things all the way through the system. Now, I won't say it has to be pretty good, but it has to have some influence with the suits who make the decisions. But I'd really like to actually get sufficient reputation to be able to to do the sort of interesting and innovative things that are going on in my mind. That I've got one particular project called, it's based on a short story that Paul Collins put out in an anthology last year called Running Invisible. And because my time is fairly constrained, I tend to go jogging quite late at night. I'll go jogging down to the beach and along the beach and then come back again. And I've noticed over the years that if you jog at a particular speed, people leave you alone. If you go too slowly, the drunks will come running along with you and that sort of thing. And if you jog too fast, you draw attention to yourself, and people in cars throw beer cans at you and all that sort of stuff. And if you jog at exactly the right speed, they don't pay you any attention. The police don't pull you over and ask why you're dressed in black and running along in the middle of the night. The goth jogger are reasonably well known, apparently, in the beach society. And I based this short story about a kid who, because his parents are undergoing marital difficulties, there's always a lot of shouting at home, and he gets used to jogging late at night, and then he realises that he becomes invisible if he jogs at a right speed, and he sees foxes and possums and other night creatures, and then he starts seeing burglars, and the burglars don't see him. He goes around the corner and rings the police up and all this sort of thing. And then he starts to see a really weird world that nobody else can see, and he's invisible to both worlds. It's a shadow world sort of thing with a very, very strange, populated with very strange people, and then this particularly luridly made up lady starts to notice him from the shadow world, and in the last scene you can hear footsteps jogging along behind him.
Oh.
So about to make contact, and I'm expanding that into a novel for Chap Who Wants a Novel, but I'm also expanding that into a script as well. And conceptually it's quite difficult, because I don't want to do a Neverwhere or a Stardust or any of the usual alternate world sort of things. I want it to be quite different, and so I've had to conceptually work on what this world is and what goes on in it. But I think it'll make a really super movie, and it's better than just writing yet another fantasy novel or whatever else. Trying to go into some more interesting area rather than just say, well, I've managed to establish myself as a novelist writing science fiction. Oh, good, I'm going to do that forever. I think it's fairly limited. Make a lot more money by staying in the one field. Originally, the publishers wanted me to keep on writing great winter novels, and I had quite a decent following, but I made the decision to go off and try other forms, which in some ways was mistaken, in other ways I think helped me develop into an entirely different author. Probably wouldn't have got a Hugo nomination if I'd actually stayed just with the Great Winter series, so that's what I like to think anyway. I may be wrong.
So you're always striving to grow, to evolve.
Yeah, to grow, to evolve, and that's, I don't even know what's coming. I'm just thinking, well, I didn't know I was going to get the Hugo nomination. I didn't know I was going to be able to turn my jogging into a short story that may end up as a film. I didn't know that reading about particular things in 19th century computing would actually lead to the story I'm writing. Well, start writing as soon as you go, actually. I mean, I'm currently in the middle of writing that story. When I was over in, where was it, Reno, for the Worldcon, one of the people from audible.com came up and said, look, I heard your talk, we like your voice, would you like to do readings for us? And here it is 2 years later, and I haven't really followed it up, but I started like when I wrote Summoning the King. It's written to be read, and there's several other stories that actually would make quite good readings, so getting into doing CDs of readings, which is apparently quite big. People plug their phones in and just walk around listening to stories while they're doing other things, which is very practical. And apparently the demand for readings, stories that are written for readings, is quite big. So that's yet another area I'd like to get into.
Yeah.
Answering your question, I hope.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I was just wondering, more specifically, what are the projects that we can see coming from you? Like, what is, what's the next story, the next novel, in the shorter term?
In the shorter term, novels are pretty hard to sell. You almost certainly heard of the Midwest implosion, and I was one of the victims of it. I'm not ashamed of it. We're all adults and talk about these things. I mean, I noticed I wasn't getting promoted as heavily as I could, and publishers don't like to dump authors, make enemy. As Oscar Wilde once said, choose your enemies with exquisite care. So you'll sort of be run down rather than actually dumped. And what I noticed is that while my representative, I suppose you can say, at the company were saying, your stuff isn't selling, or I'd have fans writing in and saying, we can't get your stuff in the shops. So I think, well, they want people who can sell 100,000 and I'm selling 20,000. That's the sort of figures. And I mean, that's still a profit, but it's not sort of the big time profit. There's dozens, hundreds, possibly thousands of people selling, around about 20,000, and they want to pick out the really big winners, and I was writing for basically too small an audience at that stage. So I decided, at a particular point, I was going to go into young adult and really give the American market a rest. So I've got an entirely separate income. I'm not dependent on writing, so I could afford to make that move, whereas a lot of other people, the writing is their life and their income, and they got very severely trashed. Which is, as I said, it wasn't a tragedy for me, but it was quite a tragedy for quite a lot of authors. But having, a wealthy patron, my employer, gave me the freedom to actually say, well, I'll go into film, I'll work harder on my short fiction, I'll polish it up a bit more, I'll explore more ideas without having to put a whole novel together. And I've got a novel going. I experimentally put it up on the web a couple of years ago, and I got some fan reaction, and decided to rewrite it in a different style, so I'm doing that as a background task, but the film work and the story work is taking up a bit more time. And if it's not fun, I won't do it. I really like doing readings. I've been working on some music to intersperse in the background of the reading. All of that's really good fun. It's fantastic working with a film crew. It's fantastic having the writers round, the actors round, and seeing what they think of the script and having them throw in suggestions, and then putting those suggestions in.
So you're looking
I love all
more
that sort
at
of stuff.
so you're actually moving more into performative work and working with teams and really seriously looking at the movies.
I think I think that's right. There's other things that, look, the market's changing and the rules are changing. Once again, to refer to that landmark address that Neil Gaiman gave last year, the gatekeepers are leaving their gates. And what do? Because the gatekeepers used to actually determine the standards, and if you meet the standard, well, the publisher would come along and they'd publish you and they distribute you, whereas now anybody can get published, but very few people can get visibility. The internet has made it possible for anybody to get published, but it's much harder to be seen because there's got zillions of people out there who are all publishing their own book, and most of them aren't very good, not to put too fine a point on it. And the problem, like you talk to fans in signing, and they say, well, yeah, I really hate this modern world because there's so many titles out there, and I can't get a reliable gauge of which ones are good and which ones are not. Quite often a reviewer will have very idiosyncratic tastes, and they'll say, oh, this is a wonderful book, and it'd be terrible. So that's a problem in the modern world. Traditionally published authors only currently, have a certain advantage, and that is, if you've gotten a reputation, people will see your name on Amazon or something and say, oh, look, Sean McMullen's got half a dozen stories up as standalones on Amazon.com. I think I might get a few and see if they're good. And a lot of the established authors now have found they can sell short fiction. They can only sell it because they've already got a name.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's really no good to beginner authors, but beginner authors, there's a lot more amateur groups. They can reach American markets and get their fiction workshopped in America, which I certainly couldn't do when I was starting out, so they can learn their craft a lot faster. There's probably other forms of fiction and creative work that nobody's thought of yet that people will think of in 2 years or next month or tomorrow or as we speak. So it's very exciting and dynamic, but you've got to keep an eye on the market and see what advantages you've got as an author or as a beginner or whatever else, and not just write the stories and hope people will publish them. They won't anymore. You have to you have to look upon yourself as a marketer, and it comes full circle back to where I was in the early 80s, because I didn't have a mentor. I had to teach myself everything about writing, and I made a lot of mistakes, but I gradually caught on. And then, like later on, people started telling me things. Terry Pratchett, later on said, "Oh, look, I left work at a certain time and I started doing that. You should have done blah blah blah, but it's a bit late now." Or, that would have been great if I'd known him back then. But in Australia, you're a bit isolated, and that's why. Why did Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman collaborate on Good Omens? Well, because they lived in England. I mean, they had access to each other, whereas over here we had authors, but a vastly smaller market, and basically people not in a position to be a good mentor for overseas markets. I got some appalling advice about how to sell overseas by people who were just lucked out. And I won't name names, but you know, I learned my lessons and all that sort of thing. But yeah, there's an awful lot of dead ends. Australia's difficult to write from. The internet has made it easier now than it was. Australia, New Zealand. I've done a lot of promoting New Zealanders to write their own fiction too when I was there. But it's easier now, but it was very hard when I was developing. But you know, not a bad thing, because I eventually got in, and now I've at least got a name, and you can use that.
Yeah, so you've got a lot of things, a lot of irons in the fire. Have you got anything, any project that is going to be published or released soon?
I mean, like Hard Cases needs to be released as a formal release. I saw Terry about that last Friday, and we're targeting some other film festivals now.
So look for that.
Look for that. Look for that. I'll keep it on our website and Facebook and all the usual things. I'm appalling at Facebook, but I usually manage to update it once a week. So please be patient with me. In terms of short fiction, I'll have a couple of other stories I'm working on. I'll have one of them finished by the end of the month, and it'll probably sell. My fiction usually sells on first or second submission, generally on first submission. So I'd imagine, like, I've got 3 more stories planned before the end of the year, and they'll probably sell, and they'll probably come out next year. I've got the long-term novel I'm working on. That's about 200,000 words. The Keeper of Boundary, and film scripts certainly, and then there's a couple of shorter novels. One of them, the Jogging Invisible thing, there's a book and a film that are people want me to write, contracts and that sort of thing, but they'll publish it, or they'll try to find funding if I finish it. So I've got a lot of stuff like that. And then,
so it's a matter of keeping an eye on your website and following you on social media.
Yes.
Watch this space.
Yes, I try to keep the website updated reasonably well too. But just keep on watching Facebook. I try not to crowd it out with sort of domestic living and that sort of thing. I mean, I think my domestic living is fairly boring. I mean, why talk about it?
So we can rely on you not to give us pictures of your food. We're really grateful. Deeply, deeply grateful.
I have never posted any sort of food on my website.
Thank you for talking to Dark Matter.
It's been a pleasure talking to Dark Matter.